Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. Today's guest has globe-trotted from the Far East to visit with us. I first found his insights and must-read portrait of modern China when reviewing for USA Today his 2012 book, The End of China. Founder of the China Market Research Group, a strategic consultancy that targets Chinese consumers and whose U.S. clients include Apple and DuPont, Rein arrived in China 2 decades ago when job opportunities were scarce. That all changed as he chronicled with extraordinary clarity China's economic might and her middle class, 350 million strong, exploded. Shaun Rein's new book, The End of Copycat China, similarly combines lucid prose, professional reflection, and intimate access to the Chinese business community, whose billionaires now rival and outnumber those in the United States. Its thesis claims a rise of creativity in China. Shaun Rein once again gives us an incisive survey of the social dynamics at play in China's pursuit of a more savvy economic orientation, including a comment on the vast environmental degradation. I want to test his assertion today that an end of copycat China is possible in the continued climate of crackdowns on dissent. Shaun Rein, we've never met, but it's a pleasure to have you here in our studio in New York. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Alexander. It's a pleasure. I just came in from Shanghai just for your show, so thanks for having me.
So how about this question? In contemporary China, are those newfound values of creativity and that aspiration for creativity, and of course individualism you highlight, are they compatible with the mantra, as we understand, or a majority of people in the States understand, of economic orientation first, human values second?
I think that's a great question. Let me start off with looking back 20 years ago when I first arrived into China. When I first came there, people were dirt poor. The vast majority of Chinese were still struggling to eat and were at below the poverty line. Let's jump now. Okay? In 2011, 21 of China's 31 provinces increased their minimum wage on average by 21.7%. In January of this year, 18 provinces increased minimum wage on average by another 18%. So what you've seen in a 2-decade period is people moving from not being able to eat towards being fat. There's an obesity rate of about 12% in China that's almost as high as the United States. And so what's happening is as people get wealthier, they're starting to think more about just the raw basic needs of human life, eating, shelter, and they're starting to look at what's important. And so they're starting to say, you know what, I want to be able to express my individuality, whether that be through art or through clothes. It could be going off and using WeChat, which is an online phone system, kind of like a Twitter, but more supercharged, where they can show pictures of them traveling around the world. What's happened is now Chinese are starting to question what is important in life. What does it mean to be Chinese right now? There's really been a real big shift, Alexander, in the last 2 years with the new president, Xi Jinping, saying, let's define the Chinese dream. Let's look back at the Chinese roots, not with embarrassment. Let's not look at, say, Chinese culture was bad, as many had begun to think, which is why there was this aspiration for everything foreign. And let's create this new modern, strong China. Let's create a new definition of the modern Chinese dream. And that's why you're starting to see people think about individualism, creativity, and expressing themselves within the confines of the party in a different way than we've seen in the last 3 decades in China.
But that's the point, within the confines. Elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think there's...
And what party?
Yeah, so the Communist Party. So China's government remains a one-party state. And I think what you've seen with the new president, Xi Jinping, is he's probably the most powerful leader since Mao Zedong 40 years ago. There was a lot more leadership by consensus under President Hu Jintao and President Jiang Zemin. President Xi is really consolidating power. You can see he's putting in a lot of allies in the military, in the foreign service, as well as in the Ministry of Finance. Now, what that means is people can say whatever they want to say on the economic side. But the government is still really concerned about social instability. And so there still is a limit on dissent. There's a limit on pure freedom of speech. It's definitely much better than it was 20 years ago, but it's still not good enough. But again, I think we need to look at it through the context of Chinese history. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of Americans don't realize that the people who suffered the most during the Cultural Revolution, the time between 1966 and 1976, when most universities were closed in China, the people who suffered the most were the ones who are now in charge. If you look, President Xi Jinping, his father was sent off to the countryside in pseudo jailship for 18 years. And the rumors that when he came out from the countryside, he didn't even recognize his sons. And so the overarching goal of today's leadership is to ensure you don't go back to social instability. Now, I think sometimes they overreact and they do too much on the limits of freedom of speech, but you just have to sort of understand it's not quite as black and white as a lot of Americans make it out to be.
And that explains the absence of Twitter or other multifaceted international forms of expression that do exist in most contemporary democracies.
It exists almost everywhere. It's kind of embarrassing that China doesn't allow Twitter or Facebook.
So what is the argument from the Chinese position of how they are not embracing some of these innovations that are shared by the globe and are isolating themselves in their individualism?
Let me answer that in two parts. The first is the internet, okay? So Twitter, Facebook, Google all have accessibility problems in China. Twitter and Facebook are completely blocked.
It's censorship.
They were actually accessible for a number of years, but it stopped when you started to see some of the rioting in Iran, and the government started to get very concerned about having social instability spread throughout the entire country and people going out and starting to riot. They blocked Twitter, but very soon afterwards, they created another system called Sina Weibo. Sina Weibo is the exact same thing as Twitter, except has even more functionality. The Chinese innovated to create things for the China market. So while we say there's no Twitter, most Chinese actually don't feel like they're missing anything because they have a clone, essentially, of Twitter, where they're allowed to discuss. Now, what does the Chinese government do? They force a lot of the internet players to have in-house censors to take down questionable posts. You also have the government will come in and say to them, you need to shut these things down. But for most Chinese, they don't feel that
they don't feel the restriction because they are innovating at home.
Yes.
But they're closing off their innovation in the sense that it can't be an international experience yet, and Twitter can't be born out of China.
Well, that's where I disagree with you. Okay, and here's why. The actual protectionism actually has helped proliferate innovation in China. So in the internet mobile space, especially mobile space, which is sort of the theme of my new book, The End of Copycat China, because the Chinese players didn't have to compete against well-funded Twitter, Facebook, they were able to make mistakes. Initially, they had inferior products. So you had companies like Sina, like Ren, come up with virtual clones. Because they were protected, Chinese consumers had no choice. They had to use them. But over the last 5 years, some of these firms have gotten really great at research and development, and they're actually more powerful than the American companies right now because they've been competing in a non-competitive environment, and they've now started to go abroad. So WeChat, which is Tencent's company, actually has replaced Facebook as the biggest social media population in Indonesia in less than 10 months. I was in Indonesia in Q1 of 2013, and Facebook was all the rage. Indonesians had never heard of WeChat. By the end of the year when I went back, everybody was using WeChat. I was in South Africa earlier this year. People everywhere in South Africa were using WeChat. So what we're now at...
let me just ask you, are there any sensors built into WeChat for the experiences of the Indonesians or of the South Africans?
So we're not sure, and that's one of the questions. I think there's definitely things built in China. The question is what happens if there's an American user communicating with a Chinese user?
And who maintains ownership of the entities in these respective countries?
That's in a gray area. And I think one of the big problems and what's hurting Chinese companies from becoming truly global brands is the censorship. right? Because if you're an American and say you're communicating with another American on WeChat in California, or do you want to have the Chinese government eavesdropping over your conversations? The answer is obviously no. So I think the government needs to do a rethink. You know, they need to understand it's okay to be concerned about social instability, but they need a more elegant solution. And they also need to be able to ensure that the rules aren't hampering the ability for Chinese firms to grow abroad, which they clearly are.
Well, that's very interesting, because I wonder if American best practices, which have been anything other than best practices in the arena of surveillance, and the fact that many Americans now realize that they are sacrificing their own personal identity and information when they use Twitter or Facebook, some of these new social media arms. How have the Chinese reacted to American surveillance through these vehicles and the big data that's emerged? And do they want to differentiate themselves and actually be the bigger man, as it were?
I don't think they want to be the bigger man. I think that most Chinese they look at America's government with skeptical eyes. Okay, they feel that America is trying to contain China's rise. So like President Obama sent several thousand Marines to be based in Darwin, Australia. There's that pivot towards Asia, where America is pushing to have closer relations and maybe even open up more military bases again in the Philippines, where America is supportive of Japan to move from self-defense forces to having a military force. This is very disconcerting for most mainland Chinese. So they love Americans, and that's why you see so many Chinese are coming here to shop. If you look on Fifth Avenue where we are,
or Columbia University,
everybody's like a Chinese. You know, they go to Gucci, they go to all the top shops. But there is, I think, people think that the American government is actively trying to contain China, and they're concerned that as China's rise, that there's going to be more increased tension. And I'm quite concerned about it too. I'm not a political scientist by training, but just by looking at an everyday basis, the distrust of America is rising. And I think President Obama probably needs to change his foreign policy if he wants to ensure that there's a lack of tension in the coming 5-10 years.
Well, I mean, would an economic summit of some kind further that?
Yeah, I think, you know, an economic summit is always good, but I think in the back of the mind, the Chinese, the Russians, everywhere in the world are thinking, well, what about the Snowden affair? What does that mean? If the Americans were actually looking at Merkel in Germany, what are they doing in China? I think what's key is to continue to have regular economic summits. It's key to have cultural exchanges and to continue to have more Chinese come to the United States and vice versa, and try to have more military transparency. It's not an easy thing. I mean, if you look historically, there's always a tension between a superpower and a rising superpower, but I'm hopeful and optimistic that tension will decrease between the two nations. I think the business at the end of the day is what most Chinese want, and they want to have strong economic ties.
Well, that's why I ask about an economic summit, because that really is the decisive imperative. Is the 800-pound gorilla, if you will, in the room in that economic summit the debt? I mean, is that weighing on the Chinese, the debt that they've taken? I mean, we still have and are growing this very large and unsustainable deficit, and we owe the Chinese a lot of money.
Yeah, well, I think the Chinese are looking more at their economy. So when you look at it, China's been growing about 10% a year for the last 3 decades, and that's really slowed. It grew about 7.2% in Q1 of this year, and it's clear that China's growth model of the last 3 decades is broken. Okay, the country can no longer rely on low-cost, cheap labor, can no longer on manufacturing and for export. It needs to shift more towards a services and consumption-oriented economy. Right now, the average GDP per capita is about 6,000 US dollars. That's what we like to call the middle income trap. When you hit that GDP growth, typically you see a country's economy stagnates. You also see the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Very few countries have been able to overcome the middle income trap in the post-World War II period. And so right now what you see is China's leaders are trying to increase the wages, like I mentioned before, and push more services. And that's going to have more sustainable economic growth in China. It's not an easy thing, and the world needs to watch. And can China make that economic transformation?
Well, I think you're bullish in the book about China's potential to overcome a sluggish recession. But I asked you about the debt because are they in a position to point to America and say, we want our money now? I mean, is there a concern that the Chinese have, in some respects, outsourced their economic capital and their future to America, which is holding it hostage?
I think the Chinese are very concerned about the Democratic, Republican fighting and turmoil that's going on in the United States, about the grandstanding against China, the anti-China rhetoric. And so what you're having is the Chinese government is saying, we own all of this American debt. We're basically America's bankers, but our client doesn't listen to us. And so what you're starting to see is China is trying to diversify its foreign currency holdings. So it's been looking more into the euro, even the Australian dollar. The issue is that none of these currencies have the liquidity of the US dollar. None of them have the strength and trust in the investment community. So what the Chinese government is trying to do is make the RMB, the Chinese currency, or a reserve currency. And so you're seeing a lot of swaps. The Chinese will do a swap with South Korea, with Russia, in order to try to diversify away from the American dollar. But it is a very difficult thing where China basically in the 1980s and 1990s decided, let's outsource our economic decision making to the Americans. Now they've got a problem and they don't know what to do.
I mean, do you think, and you're really the best person to ask here, that there was more admiration of the United States across China, especially in terms of its political coalitions, when Richard Nixon was president? I mean, you arrived in China a younger man, but you've seen, but you've seen an evolution, and you talk about it in the End of Cheap China, of the economic status and the rise of the middle class. But one of the things I'm interested about in this whole dichotomy and conversation about copycat and China versus American interests and values is, are the Chinese still looking to Americans for their moral or economic conviction? And I would really stress the moral piece of that there. Or do they seek that kind of moral inspiration from another country, another state, another philosopher?
I think when I first arrived in China, most Chinese looked to America as a beacon of light. Okay, and I've lived all around the world. Okay, I'm American. I love the United States. I'm as great a patriot as you can be. I traveled in Eastern Europe, and I spent time in Romania and Hungary after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Wherever I lived, people looked to the United States as the moral arbiter of the world. It wasn't just a policeman with a stick. It was America would always do the right thing and would shed light into dark areas. I think in the last few years, starting with the Bush administration, but continuing to the Obama administration, Chinese feel let down. They feel that the United States is not doing the right thing from a moral standpoint. Chinese are saying, look, our government has done a great job at lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. The Chinese have never attacked another nation in recent years, and so Obama should give us more respect. But the president doesn't seem to be allowing China to become an equal partner.
What would that respect consist of, Shaun?
Well, I think there's the issue of not sending military to South Korea or to Japan or the Philippines. So a lot of Americans, we say, why are Chinese increasing their battleships or their air force? But that's what great powers do. As you get more money, it's pretty natural to arm, not necessarily for offensive purposes, but for defense. And they say that this means that China is becoming aggressive. But when you take a step back and you think that Americans are all over the world, there's 30,000 troops, an hour and a half flight from China. That makes a lot of Chinese disconcerting. But again, I'm hopeful that America-China tension will go forward. I think at the end of the day, most leaders on both sides of the country understand it's better to maintain the status quo. I'm not so concerned about America-China relations. I am very concerned about China-Japan relations. And I'm also concerned about China-Hong Kong, which the Chinese consider an internal issue. but I'm worried about how that might play out and some of the pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong and some of the anti-mainland Chinese sentiment down there that's really been rising over the last 12 to 18 months.
Well, talk about this more. What are your worries? I mean, especially in terms of your role, you run a business that caters to the Chinese and their interests and that advances their lifestyles. So what are these important issues to take hold of?
So I think, Hong Kong obviously was a colony from the UK. And so a lot of people in Hong Kong, before the country, the city, or I don't know what you would call it, reverted back to China in 1997, they wanted to maintain a closeness with the British. And now that they're pushing for more voting on their CEO in a couple of years, universal suffrage, and the mainland Chinese government is saying, you can have it, but it might be our chosen candidates. So there's an element within Hong Kong that wants pure democracy. There's an element that harkened back to the British colonial days, and they like that, and they feel different. Okay? The Hong Kong people, they feel very separate from most mainland Chinese. They speak a different language, Cantonese versus Mandarin. They were raised under a different economic political system. And they're starting to get angry at mainland Chinese. The Chinese are coming in, they have more money than Hong Kong now. All of the big $20, $30 million properties in Hong Kong have been bought up by mainlanders. You're starting to see that Chinese tend to be a little bit more gregarious, to put it politely, when they're tourists. They're loud. There have been issues of mainland kids peeing on the streets, and that's gotten a lot of Hong Kong people angry. So they've been putting in anti-mainland ads in newspapers. They've been actually putting in pictures of locusts, which stands in for mainland Chinese, and say, we don't want locusts here. You've had a lot of mainlanders coming in to buy baby formula, and so making it very hard for Hong Kong people to get baby formula now. A lot of mainlanders are coming in to give birth because the Hong Kong passport might be the best in the world. And this sort of influx of Chinese, these different people, crowding out from the good homes, from the shopping, from the beds in hospitals, from the baby formula, is creating a backlash. And my concern is, how will the Chinese government react? Okay? If the Chinese government were to crack down in a city in mainland China like a Chengdu, most people in the world would think of it as an internal issue. But because Hong Kong was previously part of the British Empire, there are a lot of people in the West who hold Hong Kong closer and dearer to the heart. And they might react and protest in a different way. And frankly, from my own standpoint, is I think the Chinese government has been very good to Hong Kong since 1997. I think that without China, Hong Kong's economy would have gone down. And I think they've largely kept to the word and the spirit of the agreement between Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher to have Hong Kong revert back to China. I think the Chinese government is in a very difficult position. No matter what they do, they're going to be criticized by these people.
Well, that also seems like an element of how these social constructs, and I mean, it's not a civil war, but it could be an emerging conflict within China. How that's a reflection of China's acceptance of other parties. I mean, and I wonder if that is going to lead them, even more than a popular uprising, towards democracy. Having to confront Taiwan, having to confront Hong Kong, do you think it will lead China to copying a more democratic?
No. I think most of the China analysts and the American government seem to get China wrong on the political side. It always amazes me, some of the stuff they put out. They said that the new President Xi Jinping is a reformer. And by saying that, they thought he would be liberal and move more towards democracy. I just don't see that. He is a reformer. He's one of the biggest reformers in China in the last 20 years. But he's reforming towards a stronger party. And that's why he's cracking down on the corruption in the country. He basically saw what happened in the Soviet Union. He doesn't want to be a Gorbachev. He doesn't want to have the Communist Party collapse on his watch. So he's looking at...
But it's almost like that's inevitable.
I
mean, the way that you're speaking, I mean, but he doesn't want to be the counterfactual that may or may not.
He doesn't want to be, so he looks at what caused the Soviet Union to stagnate. Lack of supplies in retail stores. Endemic corruption. And that's why, since he became president, he's been leading a far-reaching political campaign to crack down on corruption. People are running scared, as they should be, because too many everyday government officials and higher-ups got rich over the last 15 years by essentially stealing from the state and stealing from everyday Chinese. So President Xi Jinping is doing a great job at arresting these people. And that's why most Chinese actually support him. If you look at the Pew Center, they say there's about a 90% approval rating for President Xi Jinping and the direction that he's taking the country. So I think that a lot of Americans think increased incomes, better access to education, more demand for individual rights means that they want democracy. I don't see that. I think a lot of the Chinese are happy with the status quo as long as it keeps evolving and as long as it keeps improving. And that's why when you see the social instability, it's not so much about the government, it's about other issues.
Shaun Rein, it's really interesting to hear your perspective, and I hope you'll come back to the Open Mind and update us soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Shaun. And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other Open Mind interviews. And check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.